quickly cover our January CPU release. How well we did. Note it's unofficially titled Best Release Ever. So we shall start off by kind of showing this diagram of what the release process looks like. You can see all of these boxes are tasks and processes that need to be done. It's got a lot of moving parts. If you're not familiar with it, this diagram is very useful. I can share these slides after the show, I presume. But also, I've started to highlight where we've made significant changes since the last release in October. So I'll work through these chronologically. And I'll cover the kind of impact that they've had. So right at the very start of the process, 2 weeks before the code drops, we now branch all of our build repositories in Git. This effectively allows us to reduce the impact of a code freeze so that people can keep developing and working on issues even while the release is in progress. We also take out the evaluation platforms from the mix, leaving us only to concentrate on the actual platforms and versions we release. And we also, as part of that process, stop the nightly builds being triggered, which leaves us all the infrastructure in a state where we can maximize usage of it to speed things along. So slightly later on, once the upstream repos and the general availability tags are released, we now, rather than manually doing this and monitoring and waiting for them, we automatically trigger the build pipelines. This is a significant time saver, estimated to be between 1 and 3 days when it was done manually. So this saves us so much time, allowing us to hit our targets much better. That's probably the single biggest point of impact. Another change we've made, moving on to point 3, is that we're now validating that the Aqua test materials are correct and up to date. And if they're not, we fail the build pipeline again to reduce wasted timing, having to rerun them. We now, should that validation fail at that point, we can update the test materials and restart at that point. So again, there's less effort, less finding out something's wrong further down the line. On to step 4, once the builds are complete and we've monitored those, we are now automatically triggering the JCK compliance tests, the automated ones. And again, this used to be a manual process that once the builds were complete, somebody would have to go through and trigger all those test pipelines. So again, that's automated and is another significant saving of time and efforts. New for this release, I believe, is the release notes automation and the generation of those. I'm not sure if this has happened before. I'm fairly certain it hasn't, but that's another process improvement, and the release notes are now being pushed up to the website automatically. On to step 6. We have made some changes to how we do the manual tests. So we've standardized working directories, scripted up some of the setup, and by breaking out problematic tests from the automation into a smaller subset that occasionally need a little more effort, our automated tests are much more likely to succeed at the first time of asking. There's significant less rerunning of failed automated tests, and you have a small extra step to rerun those problematic tests. From a personal perspective, I've normally had to rerun automated tests perhaps 10 or more times on a typical release. I think I had to do 1 of those this time. So it's a big time saver and a massive improvement to my sanity. And last but not least, there are improvements to the scorecard, which we'll come on to shortly, but it allows us to monitor how well we've done on a release. And if I move nicely onto the next slide, when the technology catches up, you can see here that this is the kind of the regular scorecard that I think has been there for all the previous releases. And you can see for JDK 11, we're 100% on target. And generally we've done quite well, certainly across the primary platforms and across the secondaries as well, with the odd typical well-known problem caused a Solaris. And moving on to the new element of the scorecard. So we now have this idea of a golf score, a kind of a par score. And I've highlighted this column in green, and it shows you the idea being a lower score means we've done more work ahead of time than over time. Very similar to golf. So in this release, we've made 38 under par. And if I was a golfer, I'd retire at this point. And again, if you look back through time, you can see the kind of improvements that all of those process changes have made, that we've got significantly under par for the first time in a while, if ever. Last but not least, there's always room to improve and still things to do. Particular issues or things this time is there were quite a few infrastructure problems. Again, work is going on to resolve most of those. It's one of those things. I think that's a fact of life, that infrastructure is always going to have some element of thing, but that's no reason to stop trying to make it better. And some fixes have already been made, and we'll continue to make ones for particular problems we know about ahead of the next release in March. And there's an element of the aqua tests need the upstream GA tags. These are currently hard coded, so we kind of have to have a guess at them. Ideally, we'd like to fix that process up so they can be parameterized and passed through when the tags drop, rather than being hard coded. So ideally, we want to get that into the next release. And also, again, before the next release period, we can carry on improving those changes to those manual tests being standardized and simplified and sped up. There is a second phase of release notes automation to come. And as I've mentioned, just the Aquatest upstream tag parameterization. So that kind of covers my presentation.